Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the super community of the Zoom world. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Louise Neary, a director at Gagosian, and we're delighted to welcome you all here today. In a year marked by the promise of political transformation, and what a year it's been already, Gagosian is celebrating Black History Month with a diverse program of online events with distinguished speakers, together with a dynamic mix of live and recorded conversations, presentations of artists and their work, as well as essays and other material from the gallery's extensive publishing archives. Throughout this month, we'll be sharing a curated selection of new and existing interviews, essays, and videos from our Gagosian Quarterly that exemplify how Black histories are reshaping contemporary aesthetic discourse. This week, that selection underscores the importance of the archive, both as a rich repository of what has come before and as a generator of futurities. Along this vein, we're delighted today and honoured to introduce our very special guests, Sir David Adjaye and Zoë Ryan, who will be discussing David's extraordinary archival project, Adjaye Africa Archive, a decade-long odyssey where he photographed every capital city in Africa. We first glimpsed this archive in part in David's Studio Museum exhibition, Making Public Buildings, in 2007, one of the museum's countless firsts. As you know, David is also the architect of the Studio Museum's exciting new building to come, among so many other incredible projects. So David Adjaye is a Ghanaian British architect who has received international acclaim for his enormous impact on the field of architecture, art, and cultural studies. In 2000, he founded Adjaye Associates, which today operates globally with studios in Accra, London, and New York, and projects spanning across the globe. Adjaye's largest project to date, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., opened on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in 2016 and was named Cultural Event of the Year by the New York Times. It was. In 2007, Adjaye was recognized as one of the 100 most influential people of the year by Time magazine. And I could go on and on and on. Each accolade more distinguished than the last. Zoë Ryan is Daniel W. Dietrich II Director of the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania. And we're doubly thrilled to have Zoë here because it is such a new appointment. She joined the ICA in November of last year. Prior to this, Zoë was the John H. Bryan Chair and Curator of Architecture and Design at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she co-curated Making Place, the Architecture of David Adjaye, with the late Okwui Enwezor. And I should add a note that among our many points of contact, this is where I first met Zoë and first saw this incredible exhibition of David's, both at the Haus der Kunst in Munich and the second iteration at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it was really, I think, set a new benchmark for architectural retrospectives. Zoë's research explores the socio-political impact of arts on society. In 2014, she was the curator of the second Istanbul Design Biennale, The Future is Not What It Used to Be. You can say that again. Ryan has taught graduate seminars on curatorial studies and design history and theory at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is a member of the Design Trust International Advisory Council, Hong Kong, and sits on the executive committee of the International Confederation of Architecture Museums. Welcome, Zoë. Just before we start, I would like to, as I said, Zoë and David will be using as a point of departure, the role of the archive in David's architectural practice and the landscape. But I'd just like to say that please note that this conversation features live card captioning, and you can see an option at the bottom of your screen to turn this on. And without further delay, I'd like to hand over to Zoe and David, and say again, David, thank you for joining us from Accra, and Zoe from Philadelphia. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Gagosian, for this great invitation. And hello, David. It is a pleasure to see you. I wish we were doing this in person, but it's still a great joy to have this opportunity to have a chat, even virtually. David, I was remembering this morning that I think we met at least 15 years ago. We first met when I was at the Van Allen Institute in New York, working on an exhibition called The Good Life, New Public Spaces of Recreation. And I became fascinated with the idea stores, these new kind of typologies of libraries that you were working on in the UK, in London. And I've really followed your work ever since, and followed you to some degree as we've traveled around to see your work. And of course, as Louise noted, in 2015, had the great privilege to co-curate with the late, I mean, great is a kind of underestimation, Okwui Enwezor, your survey exhibition, made even more poignant today as we celebrate Black History Month, and obviously pay homage, I think, in this talk to him. It was really inspiring to start the show at the Haus der Kunst and take it to Chicago and then kind of reimagine it at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'll be forever grateful, as I've said to you before, David, for introducing me to Okwui and for that project, which was just so incredible. One of the things that I think, David, you and I, and certainly Okwui, had in common is that we're consummate students. We love learning, and you have an insatiable curiosity and desire to experience and discover new places, really through the lens of architecture. And as I said, I've had the great pleasure of traveling with you to see your work in the UK and London and New York, where you have offices, and even as far-flung as Moscow, where we saw your work, but also where we took the show. So we went to the garage after it had been at the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm excited to, I have some of the 7-volume tome that is this African architecture project. It's quite a hefty tome, so I will lift up 4 of those publications. Before we get stuck in, which is, I'm very excited to talk about that project, which we showed a lot of the documentation in our exhibition in 2015, and it really showed then how interested people were, but also that people just didn't know the extent of kind of modernism or that history of architecture in Africa. Before we dive in, I thought maybe we could take a step back and talk about research. And you have a very specific and I think very unique approach to research. Typically, architects are very proprietary about their sources of inspiration, what they're looking at, what they're inspired by. But you make this very public, whether it's from publishing your research, you know, in books, or on your Instagram feed, for example, which is almost in real time, I think, the things that you are seeing. So what is it about making your research public that's important to you?
Thank you, Zoe. No, I think from day one, my inspiration to get into architecture, understanding how architecture operated, the knowledge systems in which it operated, I realized that I was inspired by a different body of knowledge. I was inspired by the knowledge outside of the canon in the traditional sense, and that that knowledge just didn't have much currency in the mainstream system. And so I decided that I needed, even though I'd been privileged enough to have been to many of the places that I was inspired by, from Egypt right through to Mexico and all these incredible places, to Kyoto and all these sort of incredible places around the world. I realized that I needed to, as the work gained notoriety, also talk about the way in which it drew from a different sort of knowledge base. And I felt that it was just, you know, as much as I wanted to be really kind of secret about it and just hold it for myself, that there was something incredibly sort of urgent, to use Hans Ulbricht's kind of a statement, incredibly urgent to allow this information to really appear at the same time. And I thought, you know, maybe one of the most beautiful things I could do, and I was getting lots of, you know, young students always asking me about what I was looking at and what I was doing, was to just simply unveil the reference points and the knowledge base that I was tapping into everything but the kind of core base. And when I looked at core material, I looked at it from a very particular point of view. I would only share images that were very specific, that usually made relationships to other knowledge systems, if you look at it, and then really wanted to kind of from that, talk about the possibility of using the archive and the possibility of using research as a way to understand how to make the world, that making the world didn't require just a kind of limited dive into an orthodoxy that was kind of in its own way slightly autonomous, but to really work within the plurality of the world and the knowledge systems that are in the world to create an architecture that felt responsive to the urgency of the times that we're in.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, this project I felt really built off an earlier project. I think it was or maybe it was even at the same time, but very early in the 2000s, when you also did a BBC series where you interviewed kind of masters of architecture. So people like Oscar Niemeyer in Brazil or Charles Correa in India, which of course now even more poignant and important because they're no longer with us. And I kind of felt like you were becoming a spokesperson for architecture, but really architecture's power to engage with the world. And we're looking here at Stephen Lawrence, which I still think is one of your most important projects, especially related to social justice. Do you see this kind of, it's not ancillary because it really feeds into your work, but do you see this type of research and the work that you do really trying to help us understand the power of architecture as equally important to your role as a practitioner?
It wasn't intentional to help to do that, but it became clear that that was critical. I think that as I started to make work, and you're one of the kind of the few critics from my early the early time of my work who really understood very quickly where the information was coming from and searched into it. But a lot of writers at the beginning of my work really misunderstood the references. They thought I was sort of naive sometimes. If I'd put a blank facade in an urban context, they'd be like, well, do you hate children? I'd be like, no, I'm talking about capturing light and a different sense of privacy and a different set of cultural nuances, et cetera, et cetera. And I realized how completely codified architecture is within a certain structure of perception, and what that perception does to thinking about excellence and failure. And so, it became really incumbent that, the thing did become about those two things. Research is also, for me, I'm a creative that isn't sort of driven by a sort of authorial vision that I feel is completely unique and devoid from the world. I work for a kind of an originality in my work, but always driven from a root source of information that makes sense to the human experience. So I'm sort of completely interested in the connection to how humans make form and how we understand it and how we consume materiality and form and scale and shape. And then I'm always interested in how I understand that as an architect in the 21st century and how I want to engage with that in the world. So it's this, this dialectic, which is really important. So research for somebody who works like me is essential because there's just not enough knowledge. I mean, and people think that there's so much knowledge that it's out there. There's actually a lot of the same thing being sort of presented out there, but deep knowledge is really not that easy to find. So one has to invest in going deeper beyond the clickbaits or the kind of, the quick lines and the quick surface of imagery to really find things that actually start to really become the basis by which you can start to find a way to imagine a world that has an originality and a specificity to the time that you're in.
Mm-hmm. I think, getting back to the kind of connection between architecture and society, I definitely want to return to that as part of our conversation. I mean, as I said, I have this hefty volume next to me, and I wonder sometimes also, as you said, I mean, maybe to what resonates for me is that your research and work around architecture and teaching and other things that you do is also, I feel like it's been a way for you to open up conversations that perhaps you wouldn't have been able to otherwise, or really help position your work and what you're actually intent on in a way. And I find that so interesting with the Africa research. I mean, it was quite a feat. I mean, we kind of take it for granted now, but it took more than 10 years of you traveling to 54 cities in Africa. I remember I sort of met you partway through of that project. And I remember, as you said, the urgency that you felt of that project. And if I remember right, when I asked you early on, what was the kind of impetus for taking this on and wanting to document what you were seeing in all these different metropolitan regions, was that you felt that Africa itself was somehow slightly separating itself from you. You were born in Tanzania. You grew up, for your formative years were in Africa. Obviously, your family traveled extensively before relocating and establishing your family in the UK, but that you felt that you wanted to, as an adult, return to Africa and make your own memories, maybe, but have your own experience in your own right with Africa and the continent. Do I have this right?
No, you have it absolutely right. And this idea of, because of the lack of critical information about the continent, except sort of in very limited, obscure channels, and the way in which the continent always becomes the sort of, what I call the sort of, feel good for developed countries to sort of use as a kind of, well, look at them over there, being a bit hard, but it sort of feels like when you especially hear how the presentation of the continent really feels like it's somehow on a different planet almost. And I realized that I found myself starting to consume that information and not having any more resistance to it. As a child sort of growing up, I always had my family home, and the richness of that always kind of banished any sense of negativity that anybody could throw to me at the continent. But as a young adult, when I lived alone in the city, that became a kind of memory. And I started to realize that I really needed to kind of engage with my own memories, and not just my childhood memories, but my own memories of why the continent was important. So at first it was a kind of autobiographical sort of, return. I went to all the countries that I went to with my family. And then very quickly I realized, oh my God, just that half a dozen sort of blew my mind. And I was like, there are just whole universes that are not even discussed, and whole ways of being, of black people being in the world that are just not even understood, in the way that Black people exist within the Western world, within the West, is very different to the way in which Black people exist on the continent, with a kind of history that goes back millennia. So it's a kind of energy that I suddenly realized, oh my God, I didn't have anymore. I only had it in a sort of limited way, and I wanted to engage that again. I wanted to engage that confidence and that sense of belonging to something which was a long trajectory, not just something that somehow just started to exist through the lens of another.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so fascinating, because we we talked a lot about how, for you, this research was very personal. You're taking it on, we're seeing it through your lens. It's your own process of discovery in a way, but that you were never interested in the outcomes, obviously, when you finally published the research, being about your own personal scenarios, but really about sort of how architecture sits in the world. And that's what, it's great that we're now seeing many of the images from the volumes. One of the things that strikes me looking at them now is it's really quite lo-fi. You were traveling on your own, often with your phone. Sometimes you were telling me you were snapping pictures out of like taxi windows because you didn't want to miss anything. And in that way, I find the thing that's interesting to me as you look at these images, it's very self-explanatory, is that there's informal, there's very formal images, but they're not the straight architectural photography that we've come to understand, which is often devoid of humans and the isolated kind of iconic images of Africa. I'd love to talk about to have you talk more about how you kind of went about this project, but this idea of breaking down the hierarchies in terms of what you were looking at and understanding.
No, it's really interesting. I realized that I was just surrounded by books that exoticize sort of certain parts of Africa through this extraordinary, sort of stunning visual photography. And what it did was that it actually, for me, further ostracized the reality of its everydayness. So I just absolutely refused to take a good camera. I took very cheap, simple cameras, And it was pre-phones. I mean, phones and taking pictures of your phones, only about 5 years old in real terms. I mean, before then it was like, ever decreasing phones that became like credit cards. And I think I went through every evolution. And what you're looking at is like lo-fi, early 2000 imagery right through to the latest iPhone sort of snapshots, towards that sort of moment. And, I always wanted to go on my own. I didn't want to go with a crew because I wanted it to be my own fragility. I wanted to be fragile in the African continent in a way that just stopped me thinking that I was in a place that I should be scared of, So I wanted to kind of switch that off, because it just became, there was so much information about danger and trauma and problems. So by going on my own and learning to negotiate, to be there on my own, I sort of gained my own confidence about this place. And it was not secondhand, and it wasn't, something that would be sort of learned through a book or anything like that. And then I was able to then really go, I would never take a guide. I would never hire anybody that was formal. I would always hire a taxi driver and agree an hourly rate. And I would say to them, show me your city. And, if it took 2 weeks or a month, I would pay happily. And it would just be an hourly rate. And I ended up becoming incredible friends, with these extraordinary characters all over the continent. I sort of recorded some in the book because I think only halfway through that I started to take pictures of them, because at first I didn't want to be so formal. But I kind of sort of presented them in the back, and they were really like these extraordinary sort of everyday people who showed me the highs and lows of their cities. And, with most of them, within sort of 3 or 4 days, I went to their homes, I met their aunties, I had food with them. We were sitting on their porch in the evenings thinking about the next day. And so it allowed me to engage in a way that was deeper than just being a voyeur in a hotel that got dropped off. And, it just allowed me to kind of get in deeper, which I really valued so much. So really, the images are about as being as ordinary as possible. And I really love I even have some fuzzy images, which my publishers were like, what are you doing? And things tilted and not straight enough. It's like, I just wanted to feel like anybody could do this, and that it was extremely ordinary. And in a way, it was about the kind of sort of ruthless ordinariness of it was what this whole archive was about. The book, which is the tomb, is actually only a certain edit of the 40,000 images I have of the continent at the beginning of the 21st century. I somehow managed to time it so that I did it from 0 to 2010, the first decade, and I documented every capital city. And I have that database of 40,000 images, and it's in my personal archive. And to this day, I still use that information that was for me, and for me, that use of that information is not about trying to copy. It's not a replicating system. It's one that starts to talk to me about certain attitudes and relationships and layers and certain porosities and certain ways in which luminosity works in different geographies and different contexts, and how sort of Black people on the continent have sort of used that to create their environment, both old and new. I specifically just showed only modern cities, but I was always visiting the rural landscapes as well, because I was very interested in that. But I didn't take sort of tons of photographs of that. At that time, really focused on the idea of the Metropolitan, because I was obsessed with this idea of, as it were, flooding as much of the system with images of the contemporary city, not just images of the vernacular and the parks and the animals.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's one of the most fascinating things about the project. The other thing that's really interesting is actually the way you divide up the images and the information into real geographic zones with very different climates and landscapes. And I wondered if this is how you experience these cities yourself, or why you decided to divide the book that way, and then what did it reveal to you?
It really was, I had a kind of intuitive sense of geography and culture, and many of the architects I loved talked about it. And, I studied with the Smithsons, when they were both alive, and, the idea of climate was a critical part of the discourse, but it was always just theoretical. And I think when I did this journey around the continent, the one amazing thing about the many amazing things about the continent is that it has these geographies that are very, very distinct. It's not a hybridized set of continental plates that have merged or kind of collapsed. There's Rift Valley, which is ripping, but essentially what it has done is to create what's unique about it is that it's created these extraordinary distinct zones. And that's the image of the drawing that I made. I sort of made what I call my map of Africa. which are these it's a kind of multicolor, polycolor sort of diagram. And I realized that you could move through zones in very distinct ways that had incredible histories that went back a very long time. And going through that, I suddenly realized that, my God, here was a visual demonstration of all the possible conditions of the planet on this one continent, from the mountain high velds right through to the Sahara Desert. And here were the different ways in which human civilization has evolved on every single type of terrain that the planet could produce. Hence our multiplicity on the entire globe, because essentially the continent contains all the geographies that you find all over the world. And what also you found, for me, what is the great loss with the colonial encounter is that the eradication of what was the architecture of that time, really, I think is a kind of world loss of an extraordinary archive of history in the service of power. But then the rebuilding has remnants of an attitude, which I then felt was critical to just capture and start to feel. Photography doesn't capture atmosphere very well, but it gives you enough information to be able to kind of decode and analyze.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that you now live in one of these geographies. You know, you have relocated to Accra in Ghana. I think it's the forest section of the volume, which is the largest book of the set. Yes. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about, what was the impetus for relocating?
So it became really clear, especially after I'd completed the Smithsonian, that my yearning for not just kind of visiting the continent, but spending maybe the second half of my life here was becoming stronger and stronger. And I was just lucky enough to have been in a position where the political scene had changed in Ghana, and there was a kind of thirst with this new administration to use architecture as part of nation building. And I felt that was the calling, that was the last push that I needed. So it was the perfect nudge. And so I established the office first and wanted to see that it could work. And then I brought the entire family, we discussed it as a family. And then, we all decided this was an amazing thing to do and an incredible experience to go through right now. I have a young family, and I wanted them to also experience the continent as in their DNA as young kids. They were born abroad, but I wanted them to also feel the continent as young kids. But then also selfishly, I wanted to just actually now be completely immersed in one of those climates, as you said. And in a way, it confirms for me being here, everything from the way in which one makes a life to the way in which one makes, food and kind of lives. That there's a kind of an extraordinary other quality and sort of richness that is another way of thinking, which I now, value very deeply, and complements to the time that I had in both London and New York, which were incredibly rich experiences for me about understanding those worlds. So, it's really, as you said, this thirst for not just sort of what I call simulated or simulacrum of knowledge, but this thirst for experience and sort of written knowledge, or simulated knowledge, as I call it, is part of my sort of deep sort of yearning as a kind of creative person in doing what I need to do. When I see an image of a structure or a ruin or a building or an artifact that I love, I research it deeply, but also I want to always see it. And, from my student days, I would, there was a gang of us, a gang of three, kids from my degree days that would, every time we had a lecture on somebody, Khan, Corbusier, whatever it was, Luxions, we'd always on the weekend try and go. We'd go that weekend. We'd sort of have all these part-time jobs, put our money together, go and see those buildings before the next lecture. And it was like a little game that we played. But, I did that with these two friends who I adore. We live in different parts of the world now, but it was such a rich experience, because it sort of allowed us to kind of engage with the work beyond the books and to really have our own memories of it. And I think that that's still something that I use very much in the way that I never just take things for, I take things as they are, but use them as tools to go deeper into the.
Zoe, I'm going to I'm going to jump in for a moment while we're waiting to find David again.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to just keep asking him questions. And
yeah, and I just want to
come back.
If you could just go back perhaps to that time when you and Okwui and David, you know, decided to embark on this project. And you know, of course, that's where I met you, and I'd met David back in 2005. But and so, of course, I heard a lot of snippets and scraps, but very subjective from one point of view. But it would be really great if you could go into the show a little bit as well, because in a way, it was such a cultural exhibition in terms of how it involved cultural artifacts, artists' work. You know, I remember, you know, Isaac Julian and John Okonfor, and, you know, it was such a rich approach to architecture, which I think, you know, reflects so much of David's world, because I think one of the many reasons why I think we revere him so much in the art world is because he's been known from the very beginning of his career as a collaborator with artists. He's done some really incredibly significant projects with you know, many of the contemporary moment's most beloved artists.
No, absolutely. I think that was what was so interesting about when David, you know, I've been talking to him for maybe 5 years about doing an exhibition. And it was when he won it was right when he won the commission to do the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we really picked up the conversation then and, you know, said, let's do it. Let's try and develop the show so we can launch it with that project, because we knew how meaningful that would be. And it was David's biggest project to date. And I can't remember, I think he was also at the same time having the same conversations with Okwui, and he brought us both together. And I think what you just said is so interesting, because how we worked was, I very much obviously came from being a creator of architecture and design. And Okwui approached it from really being, you know, so connected with artists, and together we kind of, that's how we made we wanted always to have a very multi-layered exhibition that really showed all the different relationships and reference points that are really imbued in David's work. But I look at all the work that he's doing now in Africa, and it's, for me, it's civic spaces, it's cultural spaces, it's work with artists. I mean, this is how David's practice was born. I mean, he started by doing projects for artists, artist studios, and then their homes. So spaces to produce work, to present work, artists living with their work, especially in, you know, the projects in London and now all over the world. But then he was always interested in civic spaces, what it meant to create a museum in our time, or a you know, a memorial, or a public space. And so these became the kind of genesis of the exhibition. And it was fantastic to bring together, you know, I think also some of the public programming around the shows was really with artists. So Chris O'Feely, or Theaster Gates, or artists that really were, you know, have been Lorna Simpson, and of course Thelma Golden. I mean, these are people that have really followed David and are very, very dear friends of his. So it was fascinating to kind of, on the one hand, understand, you know, their work too through the lens of David's practice. So it was a very rich experience. And yeah,
I'd imagine too that you looked at making places as well, the Studio Museum exhibition, you know, for all those years ago, which was really very early and very prescient. As I said, should we be surprised? But, you know, how you evolved, you know, how you sort of thought about that perhaps as counterpoint or.
I mean, we really looked at the Studio Museum's exhibition, absolutely, because it focused on the public buildings, and they had made some really beautiful models for that show, for example. And also we were always very interested in how do you tell the story of architecture through model making, through photography, through film and video. I mean, there's just so many ways to tell the story about architecture.
We're talking about you in your absence.
Thank you.
So is he back? Oh, there you are.
We're talking about making places and your show with Zoë and Okwui. So we were just talking about, you know, the sort of evolution and the working process. So I might leave the two of you to slip away again, just to continue that for a few minutes.
Wonderful.
Good to have you back, David. So, I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating, we're both interested in, as Louise said at the beginning, like the social political implications of architecture. And one of the things we've talked a lot about, especially when we're working on your show, was and with the Africa research, was you're wanting to use this as a way to kind of connect architecture back with social discourse, which you felt was becoming very disconnected, especially in the West, and to use this project as a way to also, I guess, investigate that landscape, but also the role and the potential of architecture within that conversation. And I wondered how, now how your ideas have evolved, especially over the last year, where we've seen seismic shifts in happening across the globe, given obviously systemic inequalities in race, economics, access to public health, I mean, you name it, which are issues that are embedded in many of the projects that you worked on and continue to work on. So I wondered how you have approached that more recently.
No, thank you. It's interesting that when I started working and was very engaged in those in the ideas of kind of being much more on the ground with critical projects that were engaging with the sort of nuances in society, and to embrace that and to see that as a very important sort of nourishing sort of agenda that really makes the architecture relevant to its context and its community. The early projects like the Stephen Lawrence or the Idea Store, or the Rivington Place, etc., which were about kind of creating new art centers and new edification models for communities. I was slightly, my colleagues were like, why are you doing all these funny things? And it was sort of a bit sort of, like he gets these weird projects. They're not kind of real projects, these kind of straight classical projects. And you can see now a seismic shift in the world. And you can see, especially in all the universities and education sectors, how this idea of aligning architectural thinking to the way in which architecture has impact on the world has now become mainstream. I mean, I don't think any university around the world now is not teaching this as a way of creating criticality and engagement. And as the world unfolds more complexity, we realize how much more we still need to do to engage with this. And we realize that the projects of decolonization or of like expansive knowledge systems, or just engaging with communities in diverse sort of contexts much more directly with the sort of high sort of tome of technology and architecture which comes, but also kind of talking to our clients about engaging with the reality of communities and always being a generous custodian in the public realm, because it's not just about the site, but it's also about the impact that it has on communities that necessarily don't even use the building, but are in the presence of the building. Mm-hmm. That that for me has it's sort of intensified to a really sort of a level where I'm lucky enough now to be working on projects which are about national identity. I have a couple of projects which are really trying to tackle this notion of what is the role of a civilization now in a place. And what I have sought to do is to use that early guiding force and never to fall into, even though the projects are grand, they're like grand, they're in very symbolic places, but they always have a sense of accessibility and a permeability that allows for, I think, the highest and the lowest citizen to be made equal in the space of the architecture. I'm always very interested that the architecture allows for that equality to happen, and that the code is sufficiently sort of, as it were, not codified in favor of one agent or another in the public sphere. So, this idea of really, as custodians of the knowledge of architecture, architects using that knowledge to create certain sort of, social sort of equivalence and permeability is a critical part of the power of what architecture can do, especially in the public realm, when it's about empowering, communities and allowing them to feel that things are not being brought down to them. But yes, things have to be done because we've organized these structures, but that the system sort of melts as it engages with the ground condition. I like the idea of melting, as in the form dissolves, and this idea of dissolve across the kind of climatic of architecture from the, the interior heart to the exterior is very important.
It's interesting when you're speaking about that, because I think the idea stores are a really interesting example of this. Your entrance to one of the idea stores is from an escalator right off of the street. So, the reason you were obviously borrowing from the retail industry and other typologies, but with creating a public space. And I remember you talking about, especially with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, about using that kind of cantilevered canopy that kind of extends out over the plaza as sort of a hand that draws people in. So I think it's very interesting for me, and I'd love for you to talk more about how you create those kind of more democratic but welcoming, generous approaches to public buildings.
I just think that there are, it requires a certain attitude and humility in the architecture to acknowledge the possibility of operating in ways that are not, the sort of sometimes the traditional canon. And I just think that, for instance, on the mall, working on the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, the director, was incredibly captivated by this image that we proposed of, really somehow trying to represent the idea of the porch, which is a vernacular from West Africa that mutates into, the colonial architecture that deals with the tropics, but also is the architecture of the South, that is the lived experience of Black people. And then to find a way to evoke the energy of it without the mimicry of it. This idea of making in the 21st century architecture that is in the 21st century is a critical part of it. And this idea of being able to then somehow, there's, you don't have porches for grand, verandas, of that scale for public institutions. There's usually a portico or something like that. So the idea to making a sort of a portico that is a veranda, that is a porch, that is the exact width of the building, not a limited sort of special moment, but one that is the entire width of the building, sort of presents a kind of generosity that instinctively citizens understand. And, the place that is always full, especially when it's hot, is the space underneath that porch. And I think we put that image in our deck to sort of show that it's not a fake thing. It's literally this idea of a sort of understanding a public generosity and allowing that generosity to become the way in which you endear citizens with the work. And that is one example, but actually that example permeates throughout all the kind of work in different ways, from the idea of store overhanging the markets to, even just, in Ruby City in Texas, the idea of making a plaza that sort of builds an infrastructure of the waterfront before it's even done by the city. All these things are like very important sort of conditions that really, for me, are about always trying to extend the architecture to be as generous and as neighborly as possible with its
Perhaps I can ask you one more question, because I'm dying to hear more about what you're working on now, and maybe we can end with that. And again, I think it's very interesting that you recently released a design, made public a design for the Edo Museum of West African Art in Benin City in Nigeria, and that project probably won't start going under construction for another 5 years, because there's a large archaeological project. But you say, and I quote, that this project, which I think was in the deck, proposes an undoing of the objectification that has happened in the West through full reconstruction. I mean, I will get back to that statement, but the project is, as I said, is proposed to start in a few years after an archaeological project on the site. It's a site of immense history and culture. I mean, it's next to King Obar's palace in the capital of the Kingdom of Benin. What's interesting to me, and so many things about this project, and obviously I'm just learning about it, here are some of the images, is as we grapple with decolonizing architecture and art history, what does a project like the Edo Museum of West African Art mean for you, and also the future of the practice of architecture more generally?
I mean, that statement, which is really the core of what this project is about, as like been an interesting debate that I've been having with lots of people. And really what I meant by it is that the very premise of the notion of this museum is predicated on a return of the provenance of artifacts and artifacts reconstructed within the context of architecture, which was lost from a community for several hundred years. So, and in a way, what I mean by that is that if you think about it, that Nigerians actually have never had the provenance of those objects that they should rightly have had for 200 years or so, to evolve with them and learn with them, or destroy them if they wanted to. But that provenance was taken and objectified as sort of tropes of empire, and decontextualized, and just sort of made into objects, which then is the culture of how a sort of Western museum sort of ordered, you know, a colonial, what I call the colonial Western museum, orders like artifacts from the world, because it's about centrality of power and how the sort of periphery and the center kind of negotiate. But
you're talking about the Benin bronzes.
The Benin bronzes specifically, but also the ivories, the timber sculptures, you know, that this happened almost all over, all the cultural epicenters of the continent. So the idea is that in making this museum, yes, it will have vitrines of objects, but the objects are now back in their rightful place. And the objects are now being taught in terms of their context to what was the architecture and what was the narrative of the culture, specifically in a fully rounded way, not in an edited, oh, well, this was a mask of a king that happened to kind of go on the side, but, you know, let's move on to the next one. It's sort of a full sort of unfolding of what these objects and these pieces mean to what a civilization was, because essentially these objects were all sort of garlands, as it were, pieces of a sort of necklace that sort of talked about how the Yoruba, how the Benin royalty created a civilization, and how the civilization created one of the great cultural sort of epicenters of West Africa, you know, with all these kingdoms really all almost springing from this very profound court, which, you know, has history right back to the 8th century. So, you know, it's really almost, it's almost like returning the sort of the Parthenon, you know, the Elgin marbles back to Athens. You know, that in Athens with the Parthenon right there, it really reads as something completely different to it being in a Western museum as a fragment of empire that is sort of looking at a detail. Do you see what I mean? So, you know, that's what I mean by this idea of recontextualizing and to you know, you get what I mean.
No, I think this is obviously fascinating, complicated, but these are the ideas that all of us that are working in cultural institutions of, you know, whatever stripe and size and scale are really grappling with, and we need to be grappling with. So for me, it's really interesting to look at these issues through the context of architecture and design as another kind of, as another context through which to understand them and develop language around these challenges. So, David, it's always such a pleasure. We could talk for days on this kind of stuff, and I love talking with you. And thanks so much for your generosity today. And thanks, Louise and Gagosian. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
I wanted to say, David and Zoe, you've given us a continent of images and a galaxy of ideas and thoughts, from the natural and built environments to this most recent point about the restitution of precious cultural objects, and with them the restoration of history, which I think is such an incredibly important theme, you know, for this time. Thanks so much for letting us drop into the stream of your ongoing dialogue. It just seems as if you just picked up exactly where you left off the last time I saw you. It's been a really fabulously enriching hour, and we just couldn't think of a more inspiring way to start this new month and a new program, which we really look forward to developing and elaborating, you know, within the gallery itself. So thank you so much. It's been really a fantastic fantastic time. I also wanted just to remind everybody this is, as I said, the first of many events and many reference points for this month. And I just wanted to remind everyone to please check into our website and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on all of this. And who knows, you might get to see David Adjaye and Zoë Ryan again. Do so. But thank you.
Anytime.
Fantastic to see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Louise. This was amazing. Thank you, Zoe.